Welcome, and thank you all for being here. For those of you who do not know me, I am Eddie Weeks, your legislative librarian. Your legislative library is just across the hall here in Suite 804. Please stop by and say hi at any time. I am there to answer just about any historical question you may have about the legislature, old laws, past legislators, prior legislation, the legislative process, and even what is the history of redistricting in the state of Tennessee? What a great question, and what a great time for that question, as we have just redistricted the state once again, as we have every 10 years since statehood, always based on the federal census and designed to give equal representation to each person living in each district. Except we didn't, it wasn't, and it ain't. Now, before we begin, this talk will focus on legislative redistricting, the state, House, and Senate districts, not congressional redistricting, which would be a whole separate can of worms to be redistricted. And this talk will only cover the years 1796 to 1901, as that's all we'll have time for. Now, it's often hard to find a beginning where to start, but let's skip the Territorial Assembly and start with the state of Tennessee in 1796. The first General Assembly of the state of Tennessee had 33 members, 22 representatives, and 11 senators. Those numbers were not set by the General Assembly, but by the Constitutional Convention, which convened in Knoxville in January 1796. And those numbers were based on 2 representatives and 1 senator for each of Tennessee's 11 counties. Now think about that. Each of the 11 counties had 2 representatives and 1 senator, regardless of each county's population. The primary concern was equal representation for each county, not for the population of the counties. That first General Assembly met in March 1796, 3 months before Tennessee actually became a state. The Constitution of 1796, though, also required that redistricting be done within 3 years of the first meeting of the first General Assembly. But that redistricting was to be based not on population, but on the number of taxable inhabitants or landowners in each county. Once again, redistricting was to be based not on population, but on the number of taxable inhabitants, the landowners in each county. So what 2 groups were automatically excluded? Slaves and Native Americans. And that redistricting or apportionment was to be done within 3 years of the first meeting of the first General Assembly. So that duty fell to the second General Assembly of the state of Tennessee, which convened in Knoxville in September 1797 and passed the first redistricting act of this state in their second session, which began December 3rd, 1798. And there it is. Chapter 16 of 1798, passed January 5th, 1799. That chapter set the membership of the Senate at 12 and the House of Representatives at 24. So 36 members of the General Assembly, beginning with the third General Assembly, which would convene in September 1799. And those 36 members represented 15 counties in the growing state. But remember that the first and second General Assemblies both had 33 members. 11 senators, 22 representatives. So how could they just change the number of members for the third General Assembly? Because the Constitution of 1796 declared that the number of representatives shall be fixed by the legislature, never fewer than 22, but never more than 26 representatives until the number of taxable inhabitants, the landowners of the state, hit 40,000, and then never more than 40 representatives. The number of senators was also to be fixed by the legislature and was never to be less than 1/3 the number of representatives, nor more than 1/2 the number of representatives. Think about that. instead of conforming the size of the districts to the number of members, they conformed the number of members to the size of the districts. Now, back to 1798, Chapter 16. This first Redistricting Act is amazing. 4 senators and 8 representatives were to be elected from the Washington District. Washington County and Carter County together elected 1 senator, and the counties of Sullivan, Greene, and Hawkins each elected 1 senator. Washington, Sullivan, and Greene counties each elected 2 representatives, and Carter and Hawkins counties each elected 1 representative. Now think about that. Carter and Washington counties shared 1 senator, but Washington County also had 2 representatives. Greene and Sullivan both had 2 representatives and 1 senator, while Hawkins had only 1 representative, but also had its own senator, which was more than Carter or Washington had. The Hamilton District also had 4 senators and 8 representatives. Knox and Granger counties each had 1 senator, and Blount and Sevier counties together had 1 senator, and Cocke and Jefferson counties together had 1 senator. Knox and Granger each had 2 representatives, and Blount, Sevier, Jefferson, and Cocke counties each elected 1 representative. And then there was the Marrow District. The Marrow District also had 4 senators and 8 representatives. Davidson and Sumner counties each had 3 representatives, and Robertson and Montgomery counties each had 1 representative. Montgomery and Robertson counties shared 1 senator, and Sumner and Davidson County each elected 1 senator, which makes 3 senators for that district. And that 4th senator for that district was to be elected by Davidson County in 1799, by Sumner County in 1801, by Davidson County in 1803, and by Sumner County in 1805. And all the redistricting attorneys just fainted. So what did you notice? Each of the 3 districts, Washington, Hamilton, and Marrow, had equal representation in the legislature. The primary concern was equal representation for those 3 districts, not the counties, not the population, and not the landowners. Thank goodness they wouldn't have to do that again for 10 more years, except the Constitution of 1796 required redistricting to be done within every 7 years. But the General Assembly was only meeting every other year. So to have redistricting done every 7 years, they pretty much had to redistrict every 6 years, and all the redistricting attorneys just fainted again. So in 1805, the 6th General Assembly of the state of Tennessee had to again redistrict the state and set the number of members for the next General Assembly, which would convene in September 1807. And they set the Senate for the next General Assembly at 13 senators, divided among the now 25 counties of the state, and the number of members of the House at 26 representatives. And those numbers, 13 senators, 26 representatives for a 39-member General Assembly, lasted until the next redistricting 6 years later in 1812 by the 9th General Assembly in their second regular session. An act to apportion the representation of this state in the state legislature, be it enacted by the General Assembly of the state of Tennessee, that from and after the passage of this act, that for the 3rd septennial apportionment of representation for this state in the legislature thereof. Septennial means recurring every 7 years, and now you've learned something. Anyway, this act set the number of senators for the next General Assembly at 20 senators, and the number of representatives at 40, divided among the now 38 counties of the state, and they decided that they liked those numbers of 20 senators and 40 representatives, forming a 60-member General Assembly, because the next redistricting in 1819 by the 13th General Assembly kept 20 senators and 40 representatives, divided among the now 47 counties of the state, and the next redistricting in 1826 by the 16th General Assembly also kept 20 senators and 40 representatives among the now 62 counties of the state. But Notice what we're doing here. In 1827, Rutherford and Sumner counties each elected 2 representatives, and Williamson and Smith each elected 1 representative. But in 1829, Rutherford and Sumner each elected 1 representative, and Williamson and Smith each elected 2 representatives. In 1831, Rutherford and Sumner each elected 2 representatives, and Williamson and Smith each elected 1 representative. And in 1833, Rutherford and Sumner each elected 1 representative, and Williamson and Smith each elected 2 representatives, and all the redistricting attorneys fainted again. In the 1833 redistricting, the 20th General Assembly also kept the numbers of 20 senators and 40 representatives, and the number of counties stayed at 62. But when the next General Assembly, the 21st, actually convened in 1835, it had 25 senators and 75 representatives, which is more than the Constitution of 1796 allowed and nearly double the number of representatives allowed. And before we see how that happened, we'll take a break there to explain a few other things. You may have noticed that many of these acts mentioned an enumeration. These were not the federal censuses, but special state censuses of the number of taxable inhabitants or landowners in each county. It's also interesting to see who could vote under this Constitution. Every free man of the age of 21 and over, possessing a freehold and being an inhabitant. That's the landowners. And then there's the second part of it. And every free man being an inhabitant of one county in this state for 6 months shall be entitled to vote. You didn't have to own land to vote, but you did have to own land to be counted in the enumeration that determined the number of members and the representation of the county. The other thing to notice is that no county is split. That is, either a county is its own district or is joined with another county or counties to form a district. Or a single county could elect multiple representatives or senators, but it would be the whole county electing both of those representatives or senators, as no county was divided. The reason that no county was ever divided in forming those districts is that the Constitution of 1796 specifically required that apportionment be among the counties. No county could be divided to create a district. And that's the other reason that we paused. It was time to get rid of that Constitution. In 1834, a constitutional convention convened in Nashville to write a new constitution for the growing state. And that constitution, ratified in 1835, called for an enumeration of the qualified voters to be done in 1841 and every 10 years thereafter. So we've now switched to every 10 years for redistricting, and those districts are to be based on the number of qualified voters instead of taxable inhabitants or the landowners. So, who was a qualified voter now? Well, that Constitution was rather blunt in its description of who exactly was a qualified voter. Every free white man of the age of 21 years shall be entitled to vote. Now, believe it or not, this was still rather liberal for the time. You did not have to own land to be able to vote or to be counted in the enumeration. All you had to do was be a white man. And incredibly, in the State Librarian Archives, in something called Record Group 87, you can still find enumerations of the free white male inhabitants as provided for by the General Assembly. These are the censuses that determined representation in the General Assembly. That Constitution of 1835, again, let the General Assembly set the number of members, but now limited the number of representatives to 75 until the population of the state reached 1.5 million, and then limited that number to 99 representatives, and set the number of senators to no more than 1/3 the number of representatives. And in apportioning the senators among the different counties, the fraction that may be lost by any county or counties in the apportionment of members to the House of Representatives shall be made up to such county or counties in the Senate as near as may be practical. If a county didn't have adequate representation in the House, it was to get extra representation in the Senate. And so, the first redistricting under this new Constitution would be done by the 24th General Assembly in 1841 and would go perfectly smoothly. Now, before I go on, much of what you've heard so far and much of what you're about to hear is based on a 1962 report by Dr. Robert H. White, who was Tennessee's first state historian. And I will defer to him for a description of the 1841 redistricting. The constitutional mandate, namely, that there should be made in 1841 an apportionment of legislative membership, precipitated one of the fiercest legislative battles in the entire history of Tennessee, an analysis of the composition of the 1841 legislature, and one of paramount issue to be acted upon, is necessary for an understanding of that battle of giants. First of all, the Senate was composed of 13 Democrats and 12 Whigs. The House of Representatives consisted of a Whig majority of 3. On any joint ballot, the Whigs had a majority of 2. By a curious coincidence, 2 United States senators were to be elected instead of just 1, and as you all know, at that time United States senators were elected by a joint session of the 2 houses of the legislature. So, Democrats controlled the Senate, but Whigs controlled the House, and the Whigs had a majority on any joint vote. To prevent a joint session for the election of United States senators was the strategy employed by the 13 Democrats in the Senate, of whom Andrew Johnson was one of the bellwethers. In the form of motions or resolutions, 72 times the Whigs in the Senate attempted to meet the House of Representatives in joint session. For exactly 72 times, the effort went to naught, with the result that no senators were elected. Thus it was that the 13 Democrats in the Senate, thereafter called the Immortal 13, blocked the efforts of the Whigs, and Tennessee went without representation in the United States Senate for a period of almost 2 years. The Immortal 13 also blocked all efforts at legislative redistricting. Not only had the legislature of 1841 failed to elect United States senators, it had also declined to redistrict the state as directed by the 1835 Constitution. 2 days before adjournment, an effort was made to appoint a conference committee to try to iron out the kinks. The proposition was turned down by the Senate. Shall I advise you of the vote? It was 13-12, with the Immortal 13 still riding high, wide, and handsome. Dr. White had a hell of a way with words, and he wasn't done yet. Tennessee, neither before nor since, witnessed such a spectacle of shuffling, shifting, and sidestepping. The entire citizenship of the state was aroused to a point of panic. Newspapers of the day exhibited in their editorial columns fits of frenzy and political fanaticism comparable to monkish essays upon polemic theology in the Dark and Middle Ages. Many of these editorials, both Whig and Democratic, contain distortion of facts, twists of a sentence or paragraph, an ornate flattery of a friend, or sarcastic rebuke of an enemy. And yet, the bare bones of partisan politics of that era could not be fleshed out with blood and color without the aid of those contemporary newspapers. Let their virtues, if any, be engraven upon tablets of stone and their vices traced upon the shifting sands. But redistricting still had to be done. Finally, in an extraordinary session, which began in October 1842, the General Assembly finally passed its Redistricting Act, only a year late, but still in time for the 1843 elections. So, how did they get it passed? With an amazing compromise. Under the 1842 redistricting, These counties, listed in Section 2 of this Act, elected one representative each. Counties in Section 3 of this Act elected 2 representatives each, and counties in Section 4 of this Act jointly elected 1 representative. But notice, Washington, Greene, and Hawkins counties each elected 1 representative, and those 3 counties jointly elected a 4th representative. I cannot find an earlier example of this happening, of a county having its own representative and sharing a representative with another county. And those weren't the only counties. Lincoln and Giles both elected 1 representative and jointly elected a 3rd representative. Hamilton, White, and Bedford counties each had their own representative, and each of those counties shared another representative with a county that did not have its own representative. And you know what happened to all the redistricting attorneys. But this compromise of shared representatives seems to be what got the Redistricting Act passed in 1842. By contrast with the 1842 redistricting, the 1851 redistricting, which actually passed in the second regular session in February 1852, went much more smoothly. Like the 1842 redistricting, certain counties had their own representative and shared another representative with another county or counties, even if a county name got misspelled. But now they had a name for those shared counties: the floaters, or the floterial representatives. A representative elected to represent one county was a direct representative, but a representative shared by 2 or more counties, where at least one of those counties already had a direct representative, was a floterial representative. But remember that the enumeration and apportionment is still only of the free white male voters. And the next redistricting would be done in 1861. In times of war, the law falls silent. Incredibly, the 34th Confederate General Assembly, which convened in that building in October 1861, still did its duty. On March 13th, 1862, they passed a redistricting act. What becomes even more amazing, though, is the timing of this act. This act was passed in March 1862. Nashville had fallen to Union forces in February 1862. This act was passed by the Confederate General Assembly while they were meeting in Memphis. Not even war could stop the General Assembly from doing its duty and redistricting itself. But no General Assembly would ever be elected under these new districts. Military Governor Andrew Johnson took over in March 1862 and proposed amending the state constitution to restore the legislature. And in 1865, the 34th Reconstruction General Assembly took office in that building. But their districts were based on the redistricting of 1852, ignoring the districts created by the Confederate General Assembly, except the constitutional changes initiated by Military Governor Johnson included additional representation for certain loyal Union counties. Now think about that. They rewarded certain counties with extra representation in the legislature and amended the Constitution to do so. Yes, all the redistricting attorneys fainted again, but this showed that it was time to get rid of that pre-Civil War Constitution. In January 1870, a constitutional convention again convened in Nashville. An enumeration of the qualified voters of the state was to be made in 1871 and within every 10 years thereafter. So who were the qualified voters now? Well, that Constitution declared that every male person of the age of 21 years shall be entitled to vote. So the only requirement now was being a man and paying your poll tax. The number of representatives, again, was limited to 75 until the population of the state reached 1.5 million, and then was never to exceed 99. They got rid of those extra members for the loyal Union counties in this Constitution. The number of senators was again limited to no more than 1/3 the number of representatives. So the number of members stayed the same from the 1834 Constitution, but the number of qualified voters, all men, nearly doubled. The first redistricting done under this new Constitution was in 1871. Again, no county was divided or split to form a district. Every county was whole, either represented by a direct representative or by a floterial representative shared with another county. The main difference between this act and many of those earlier acts is that more people outside the legislature were taking notice of what these acts did. The Republican banner, November 29th, 1871. Representation. The apportionment bill as reported yesterday. Important changes in the senatorial and representative districts. The following bill, one of the most important, if not the most important of the session, was reported to both houses of the General Assembly yesterday by the joint committee appointed for that purpose early in the session. A bill to be entitled an act to apportion the senatorial and representative districts in the state of Tennessee. The idea of the floaters, the floterial districts, remained, but what had changed was that some counties were growing much more quickly than others. In the 1852 redistricting, Davidson and Shelby counties each had 2 representatives. In the 1871 redistricting, Davidson County had 4 representatives and Shelby County had 6. And people noticed this as well. The Republican banner, December 19, 1871. Under the new state apportionment, Shelby County will have 6 representatives, an interest with Fett in a 7th, 2 senators, and an interest with Fett in a 3rd. Total 10 members to look after her interests. We hope the strength of her lobby won't be increased in proportion. If so, she'll be sure to run the legislative machine from the word go. The redistricting of 1881 again required an extraordinary session, just like the session from 40 years earlier, but there was a different reason this time. The 1880 federal census had found a population in Tennessee of 1,542,000, over 1.5 million, enough to expand the membership of the General Assembly under the Constitution of 1870. 1881 Extraordinary Session Chapter 5 then set the number of members for the General Assembly at 99 representatives and 33 senators, beginning with the next General Assembly in 1883. The 1891 redistricting also took an extraordinary session, and I will again let Dr. Robert White explain why. Following the legislative precedent of 1881, the 1891 legislature bypassed apportionment due to be made that year. Neither the outgoing governor nor the incoming governor referred to the apportionment topics in his respective messages, but the legislature recognized its responsibility in regard to apportionment. In the 3rd week of its session, a law was passed providing for the taking of a census of the male inhabitants of voting age of the state. On March 27, 1891, the Redistricting Committee recommended for passage House Bill 725, Legislative Apportionment, with an accompanying substitute bill. 3 days later, March 30th, the House took up House Bill 456, which was also a bill dealing with legislative apportionment. Hereafter, considerable jockeying took place in the form of proposed amendments, offering a substitute bill, etc. Here was the status of legislative apportionment business on the day before sine die adjournment. The Senate had passed the Senate bill to apportion senatorial and legislative seats. On the closing day, the House passed a substitute bill. Each House had passed a legislative apportionment bill, but no one bill was passed by both houses. Consequently, no apportionment law had been enacted. And people again took notice. The Daily American, April 1st, 1891, duties unfulfilled. Hell of Trousdale talks about an extraordinary session. The apportionment laws, a constitutional requirement. The acts of succeeding legislatures would be invalid. Haunts of the legislators vacant, and only a few men remain. Governor John Buchanan called the men of the General Assembly into an extraordinary session in August 1891, and the legislature was once again redistricted, based still on the enumeration of male inhabitants, the age of 21 and up. And so, that brings us to 1901, Chapter 122, an act to apportion the several counties of this state into senatorial and representative districts. What the members did not know, and what they could not have imagined, was that this act, the 1901 Redistricting Act, would remain law and would remain nearly unchanged for the next 60 years. But that's a topic for another time because, ladies and gentlemen, that's all of my time. Thank you for your time.